So once again, we take in the frenzy of yet another series of deadly Boko Haram attacks in Borno State in Nigeria's northeast region. Every inch of the backwaters and still ponds of the state touched once again by the bloodthirsty savagery of these latest coordinated attacks. Strikes thought to have been carried out by female suicide bombers. President Tinubu called them desperate acts of terror by the purveyors of wanton violence and vowed stern action against those responsible. No one has admitted carrying out the attacks, though the authorities have blamed Boko Haram. But the assaults could have been carried out by the Nigeria-centered Islamic State West Africa province, or ISWAP, and they would have good reason for it, because this weekend marks 10 years since their parent jihadist affiliate, Islamic State, also known as ISIS or Daesh, tried to create a caliphate in Iraq, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East with extreme brutality. They massacred thousands of people and raped and enslaved girls and women. Well, for more on all this, I'm joined now in the studio by Amnesty International's Nigeria Director Issa Sanusi and by the International Security Analyst, Certified Anti-Terrorism Specialist, and Africa representative of the Anti-Terrorism Accreditation Board, David Otto. Thank you very much indeed to both of you for coming in. Let me start with you, Issa Sanusi, because you released a statement, your organization, Amnesty International, condemning these attacks, and you keep abreast of the impact that it's having in that part of the country. Tell us more about what happened.
Well, what happened was that on Saturday in Goza, there were 3 incidents, and all of them involved female suicide bombers. First at a wedding ceremony, and then at a hospital, and then at a place where people were mourning. So these 3 incidents happened on Saturday, and yesterday we knew that 18 people died and dozens injured. But now, before we started the program, I heard that the number of casualties has risen to 31.
Yeah, some people are reporting 30, but others, I mean, I think officially the figures remain sort of 18 at the moment.
So what is happening is that we have done a research about this, especially when we tried to focus on girls and how the war against Boko Haram and the atrocities of Boko Haram are affecting girls. In the course of that research, we discovered that suicide bombing is one of the methods used by these groups to punish girls who refuse to accept their offer of marriage. Most of these girls are under 15 or about 15, and they ask them to go and detonate it in public. They particularly ask them to go and look for where soldiers are gathered and where public are. And what they do is that they give them 2 options. Either they control the detonation, or they tell them, okay, this is what you press and the bomb will detonate. Based on our findings, we realized that most of these girls were forced. In the first place, they were even abducted. When they are abducted, they are taken in, and the ultimate demand from Boko Haram is for those girls to accept the offers of marriage, forced marriage. And if they refuse, they are then punished by being sent to carry out these atrocities. Unfortunately, these acts of suicide bombing have created a kind of stigma around the girls, to the extent that whenever a girl is moving around, she is suspected, because most of the incidents of this suicide bombing are carried out by girls. So most of the girls, some of them manage to seek help, or on their own, they remove the suicide vests and escape. Some of them were not lucky enough and they die. And one of the things they do, one of the people we interviewed who was strapped with this suicide vest said that what they do is that they get elderly people as well, not only young girls. So what they do, the elderly people, is that they lock the suicide vest, because they know they are adults, they can be able to remove it. So they lock it in a way that there is no way they can escape from that suicide mission. and they force them to go and carry it out. They use it as a form of punishment. They use it to terrorize people. Right. They target markets, they target mosques, they target churches, and it's unfortunate that it is still going on.
Well, I was going to say thank you for informing us, certainly bringing us up to date with what is happening, but that sounds absolutely horrendous. And let me come to you, David Otto. What is being said officially about who might be responsible at this stage? I mean, fingers seem to be pointing at Boko Haram, though they haven't come out to claim responsibility. But in your experience, suicide attacks are seen as one of their methods.
Yes, I mean, from a counterterrorism point of view, I mean, there's no difference between whether it's Boko Haram that carried out the suicide attack or ISWAP. The key there is that there has been a suicide attack, carried out by individuals linked to either of these groups. Previously, in the history of ISWAP and Boko Haram, ISWAP has always frowned against Boko Haram officially, using young girls as suicide bombers. I mean, one of the reasons they distanced themselves away from Abubakar Shekau between 2014 and 2017, because a lot of young girls were being used as suicide bombers. So from that angle, you might think that ISWAP doesn't have a hand in this. But you've got to also remember that most of the leadership of ISWAP at the time were quite ideologues. They believed, some of them, in the ideology of Boko Haram. But what you have now, almost 95% of those leadership members who were heading Boko Haram have been killed. So the leadership now is kind of a leaderless movement. So you will not have that kind of leadership with that kind of ideology. So it's also possible that ISWAP could be behind the suicide bombing. I mean, I spoke to a number of people within that region, and they are saying that this doesn't come as a surprise. There was information that ISWAP was actually planning to launch attacks. Whether those attacks were related to or could be related to what happened, is something that one cannot really tell. But whether they do claim responsibility or not, both ISWAP and Boko Haram are seen by counterinsurgency groups or the country of Nigeria or the world as a terrorist movement. So it is not for us to make a decision as to who is responsible, because it doesn't help in counterinsurgency. I think what is more important, for the security agencies is to understand, how these processes take place. I mean, my colleague did mention about the fact that they do somehow coerce, young women to do this. Sometimes they,
horrible, isn't it?
I mean, in one of the cases, one of the young ladies was actually carrying a baby, that they used as a decoy to penetrate into this soft target. What is very significant about this attack is the fact that you had an attack which was simultaneously or launched, between areas where they knew that these were quite weak targets.
That's a very significant point, yes.
But not just that, they also targeted the military, which is a harder target. So it just gives you the impression they want to paint is that, even though the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant, which was established along the borders of Iraq and Syria, of course, has collapsed, 2 years after it was created. They want to give the impression that the Islamic State of West Africa province still, flies the white flag of ISIS. But these groups are very difficult to eradicate, totally. Right. What we've seen is that the Nigerian military and the sister agencies have done a lot of work to deal with them.
Right.
But
well, I was going to come to that.
There. Yes, of course. Yes.
Yeah, I was going to come to that with you because David raised a very interesting point about the sequence of these attacks. I don't know if they followed this particular sequence, but what we heard was that it was like a coordinated attack. They first attacked the wedding, knowing that people were going to be taken to a hospital, and then they attacked the hospital, knowing that people were going to go to a funeral, and then they attacked the funeral. Does it look like, from your point of view, you're a man, and with your ear to the ground, your organization very much following developments on this, does it look like the authorities are on top of the situation in that place? Because they've imposed a wide curfew to try to restore order.
Well, as far as the fight against Boko Haram is concerned, definitely a lot of successes have been recorded. And we know that before now, all these incidents might be happening in a market in Maiduguri or somewhere in other places. But now, these groups have been successfully pushed to the periphery.
Right.
Because Goza, they consider it as their stronghold, they consider it as their primary because of the terrain. They are able to move around. And the fact that they have been moved to this periphery shows that the government is recording success in dealing with the problem. But from our own perspective, it doesn't end there. We have to also make sure that we address the consequences of all these things, the justice side of it, and make sure that people who are affected, both the girls that have been conscripted by force and made to do these atrocious things, get justice, and also those doing this, Boko Haram, should also be brought to justice.
Yeah,
we believe
we never see people.
Definitely, and we believe that there will only, this situation will only come to an end. As the expert has said, David, that it is very difficult to end terrorism, but we can reach a level where we can say, okay, things are in control. Right. And that control can only be possible if we have a sense of justice for all.
That's a good point. I'm going to come to you in a minute, David, but let me just ask, because you mentioned the terrain. By way of geographical location, Gwoza is at the border with Cameroon, and it is quite far from Maiduguri, which is the state capital, from what I understand, and is one of the communities most affected by the insurgency. And I understand that the region is very mountainous, so that makes it easy for the militants to escape into the countryside, basically.
Definitely, and that's why they were able to entrench themselves, because they know the terrain is difficult, and they know that this is a periphery place that is very remote from Maiduguri. Right. And they have a mastery of the geography of that place, and that is why they find it very easy. If you look at what,
so that makes it difficult to catch them.
Definitely, right. And if you look at what happened in Iraq,
right,
with Raqqa, when the Islamic State was disbanded by a coalition of anti-terrorism forces, you realize that Raqqa is a town in Syria, and the forces against terrorism were able to completely dislodge them from Raqqa, because Raqqa is a town and within a plain environment. Right. So that is why they are now, and critically we have to consider the fact that they consider Goza as their primary location, primary base, and that is why they are working hard to make sure that they show that they are still around and they are still lethal.
So it's almost as if it's the last vestige, their last sort of turf. But let me ask you this, based on what you're saying, them trying to show that they're still relevant. Let me ask you this, David. Are there concerns amongst security analysts like yourself that there's more to come and that this could spread to other parts of Borno State and possibly other parts of the country? If they're now, sort of, as he said, trying to kind of show that they're still relevant?
I think it's very difficult to make that kind of analysis in terms of, how far that, this threat can spread. We would consider this as an isolated incident, bearing in mind that we haven't had this kind of attack. When I say this kind of attack, I'm talking about a suicide attack. That it's carried out in a number of places, which demonstrates a very high level of planning and preparation. By the way, I'm not really concerned that this will have a spread. Boko Haram runs very thin in terms of its capabilities and manpower. They have been focusing most of the activities on infighting, especially after the split between ISWAP and Boko Haram, the self-suicide of Abubakar Shekau, following a clash, within that group. So they have literally been focusing a lot on trying to consolidate the little strength that they have. So I'm not very sure that they can spread further than areas within Goza, the Mandara Mountains, Sambisa Forest. So Boko Haram and ISWAP, they're primarily focusing on those areas which are very in the fringes, where governance runs very thin, or if it does exist at all within those areas. So they will focus within those areas because that's where they can survive. This is a movement that is now on a survival ecosystem. It's not one that can threaten the national stability of the country. But we must not forget that each person who is injured or killed, or, by these suicide bombers, is critical to destabilizing the state of Nigeria and other regional states. So we're not undermining that. But in terms of whether the group can really spread further, I don't think they have that capabilities. I mean, it's almost like what happened to the real ISIS. Since the caliphate was crushed by the coalition forces.
I want to come to that in a minute.
Yes,
I'm going to come back to you on the issue of Islamic State. But just to kind of round off this section of the discussion, how difficult must it be for people in Gwoza living in that area in particular, and Borno State in general, if there is always a fear, and I suppose that's the idea, isn't it? If there's always a fear that this kind of thing could happen.
Well, as we know, terrorism is about generating fear in people. And that is why they use this suicide bombing technique, to make people be afraid of going to the market, to make people afraid of going to the church or going to the mosque, going into public gatherings. But above that, we have to bear in mind that these local communities are where the farmers live. And they produce majority of the food we consume. So definitely there is a danger. Because of the economic situation we are going through, any reasonable person should be paying attention to the impact of that thing. Let us just imagine those who were affected by the bombing on Saturday. How many farmers are they? Will they be able to farm? Maybe some have been killed, maybe some have a hectare of a land or whatever. And they are dead, or they are on hospital bed, and some may even stay over a year on hospital bed. So the impact, the ramification, the impact is going to be big, and it will continue to be big, not only on livelihood, not only on agriculture and food security, but also on the social well-being of the people, because no one will be around Goza and other surrounding areas, no one will feel comfortable henceforth from what happened on Saturday to go into gathering maybe in a local market.
Yeah, well, we'll be keeping an eye to hope that there, as you mentioned earlier, there'll be further investigations and these will come to public light. But let me come to you, David, and let's turn to Islamic State, because you were already taking us there. It was 10 years on Saturday since they declared their caliphate. And those 5 years of rule in Syria and Iraq will be remembered for its extreme brutality and for its targeting of Christians, Shia Muslims, ethnic Yazidis, police officers, Westerners, anyone, in fact, who oppose their sort of narrow and violent version of Sharia Islamic law.
Yes, I mean, this is an organization, or if you want to call it that, that literally painted anyone, including their members, who turned or said enough is enough, or this ideology is wrong. Extremely brutal. And we're talking about ISWAP in Nigeria, which literally copied from the brutality of the ISIS in Iraq and Syria, but in a much more smaller scale. So ISWAP, it's what you can call the one of the sons of the ISIS movement that existed. But one of the challenges that we continue to face today is the fact that ISIS managed to transfer, in a way, its movements across Africa after it was defeated or crushed in Iraq and Syria. You now have, the so-called ISWAP in West Africa, ISWAP in East Africa, along Uganda and DRC Congo. You've got ISWAP and Al-Qaeda operating in Mozambique. So you've got all these smaller groups, which emanated as a result of the crushing of ISIS in Iraq and Syria. So that ideology which wasn't crushed. Of course, the capabilities of the Islamic State, were completely wiped out by the U.S.-led coalition, which is what I expected to see in the case of Nigeria, in the case of DRC Congo. We didn't see that level of a global coalition against ISIS. Of course, we now only have a scenario where Nigeria leads most of these counterinsurgency operations alongside Chad, Niger, and Cameroon as a regional multinational joint task force. So here we are, 10 years anniversary, if you want to call it that. We're still talking about the Islamic State, of Iraq and Syria. But I think the critical point, which of course I'm sure you're going to get to, is what is the way forward in terms of, the government, seeing what we're seeing today, whereby it's almost like the reawakening of suicide bombing. And I think critically we've had, huge successes by the Nigerian Army, the Nigerian Air Force, moving towards the Sambisa Forest, the Mandara Mountains. What we haven't seen, which is what has been one of the greatest weaknesses of this and past administration, especially when it comes to dealing with ISIS and Boko Haram in the fringes of Lake Chad, is a deployment of some kind of a Navy-based technology, because there's a lot of waterways which exist within these areas that these movements have taken advantage of. But the Nigerian Navy has what you call the Falcon Eye technology, which operates within the waters, very effective. But I'm surprised that we haven't had a similar kind of technology being deployed by perhaps the president or the commander-in-chief, in respect to the Nigerian Navy. Why they haven't deployed that technology is one of the greatest loopholes that we've seen, especially along the lakes and the many lakes that does exist. When, for example, Idris Deby Sr. Was there, may so rest in peace, he used to be very effective, in dealing with ISIS and ISWAP and Boko Haram elements, along the waterways. But since he passed away, that area has been left completely blindsided. And I think this is where most of those Boko Haram members and ISWAP members are hiding. Yeah. So notice.
That's an interesting point, which I think is worth noting. And the group lost the last of its physical territory. That's Islamic State. In 2019, but it has, as he was saying, it's shifted its focus to sub-Saharan Africa, areas including Nigeria, and that would be ISWAP and Islamic State, West Africa province, wouldn't it?
Yes, so what is happening is that, as he has said, we have a situation whereby these terror groups are exploiting failures of governance. They are succeeding in weaker states. They are succeeding where, in Nigeria, for example, the reason why the bandits are succeeding and succeeding every day is because of the absence of governance, weakness of the state. So they are exploiting this, and that is why they are successful in Burkina Faso, they are successful in Mali.
Yes, a lot of the Sahel countries.
Yes. So the weakness of the authorities, and that is why the authorities should not only focus on deploying the military. The military are trained to go and fight. But what will happen when you deploy the military to a place where there is no road? They are human beings. They have to use vehicles to go to places. So the governance side has to be emphasized as well. Not only about the military, just send soldiers. I was in the field many times, and I saw soldiers struggling to move from one point to another. And that is really unfortunate.
And that also makes them targets, doesn't it?
That's it. So the governance side has to be emphasized, and it is left for us Nigerians and other Africans to demand of our leaders to be responsible. They should start to be responsible.
That's a good point. Yes. And let me come to you for a final word, David. I mean, it's interesting that we're talking about Islamic State, despite not having any fixed base. I mean, for the original sort of caliphate builders, IS has kept up a stream of online propaganda and continues to convey its message of hatred and intolerance.
I think this is because the so-called Islamic State then realized that the whole idea of having a state which is physically present, controlled, occupied by its members, it's not going to be possible due to counterinsurgency operations by coalition movements. Boko Haram also realized the same, that there is no way we will establish some kind of an Islamic state in Gaza and the government is going to fold its arms. You know, you can claim that you have flags raised in a particular location for a couple of days or so, but that is not going to last, and that's not the you know, the kind of picture that, you know, ISIS and ISWAP expected to have. They thought they could have a state of their own, but we now know that it's impossible for them to achieve that goal. So what they're doing now is just to frustrate, you know, a counterinsurgency government, you know, to ensure that there is no stability. So we need to come up with, you know, what I call a multi-dimensional approach. Again, as my colleague did mention, you know, it's not just about the kinetic operations. You know, we've got to talk about non-kinetic operations, intelligence-based or driven strategies. You know, a people-driven strategy where the people who are actually the biggest victims of this movement are at the center of the solution. I don't base my judgments or, you know, analysis on whether it's girls who have been used or boys. I think, you know, what we should focus on is that the general population gets the short end of the long stick when it comes to terrorism in general. And I think what the government needs to do is to look at those areas. But it's very challenging for a state that hasn't been able to deal with areas that it says it governs in terms of the austerity, in terms of the hyperinflation, for that state to now be looking at trying to do something in areas where it doesn't have governance structures within that. So there is that priority in terms of, you know, what do we deal with first and what is the most immediate need. But, you know, we shouldn't forget that terrorist groups are watching, they are not sleeping, and if we do, you know, fold our arms, they will strike.
Very illuminating conversation. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. David Otto is an international security analyst, certified anti-terrorism specialist, and Africa representative of the Anti-Terrorism Accreditation Board. And of course, Issa Sanusi is Amnesty International's Nigeria director. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.